Red Dead Redemption 2 is a brilliant game, but it's not without its flaws. And those flaws range from mild head scratchers to, well, rage-inducing annoyances at times. Now, if you're a fan of this game and those words upset you, do not misunderstand me. I did thoroughly enjoy the game. I loved this game. I've made a video where I talk about the fact that I love this game. I'll leave a link to it on the screen somewhere right now. So, all games have flaws. All games have something in them that I'm not impressed with, and this game is no exception. And please don't tell me that whatever it is I'm discussing is just the way Rockstar does it. It's a Rockstar thing is something I've seen quite a lot. Knowing that this is something that occurs in other games that they've made does not change my opinion as to whether or not it's good or bad. So, you're kind of wasting your time with that argument. So what do I mean by flaws? Well, I don't mean bugs and glitches. I'm not talking about the times when you go into a scripted scene where something's rushing at you and you pull your weapon out to shoot it, only to find you've got a weapon in hand that you didn't even have on you. In fact, the weapon in question is supposed to be securely in a chest somewhere 1,000 miles away. And to make matters worse, it's not loaded. So you're busy watching a slow motion reload animation thinking, oh, I'm gonna die now. That's a bug. That's a mistake. It's not something they did intentionally. It's not a design decision. I'm talking about things like the save system, for example. Why doesn't it remember where the character is when you saved? Why am I loading a game expecting to find myself, I don't know, in a tavern, but instead I'm some other random location looking wistfully off into the distance? Why can't it remember where my horse was? More importantly, why can't it remember little things like the fact that I've just paid for a room, or I've just paid for the full treatment on my horse? Because I load the game up and my money's gone, the money I spent on those things is gone, but I don't still have the room. And my horse cores are back to normal. It's not remembered that. And I get it. You want to keep the save game size down, so you're not going to remember every single location of every dead bunny and twig in the world. But the location of the character, the horse, and certain very basic things are not going to bloat your save noticeably. And people say to me, well, you've just got to imagine that the character has a life of his own, and whilst you were away, he went off and he did things. No, I don't. I really don't. I do not want to imagine that. I don't want to be loading up the game like some amnesiac wondering what I did last night and stood there in an episode of Dude, Where's My Horse? I want a coherent narrative with a coherent timeline where I know exactly what I'm loading into. If I've saved the game in a tavern, paying for a room, paying for a meal with my horse outside, when I load the game up, just have me there. It's not a big ask. On a related note, why does this game have a respawn system instead of a reload system when you die? For those of you that don't quite understand the difference, a reload system when you die is where the character dies and of course the story's ended. You can't continue because you're dead. So the game reloads to an earlier point in time. It essentially erases everything that happened between that point and the point you died, and you carry on hopefully a new timeline, a new trajectory where you don't die. It's a Groundhog Day until you get it right. The important thing is, you the player, you kind of know in an alternate timeline you died, but the game character doesn't. There's no sign in-game to the character that anything untoward happened on the reload. You know, the character is just back in time, things have been reset. With a respawn system, you die and then you magically appear somewhere else, usually with some sort of penalty. Perhaps you've lost some pelts, perhaps you've lost some money. Time is not reset, so there are actual consequences for the character dying. Now in multiplayer games, this is just the standard way of doing things because it's pretty much the only way to do things. You can't sort of magically reset time back to a point where one player was alive, because that will reset it for everyone else. So respawn sort of makes sense in a multiplayer sense. In single player narrative driven games, they don't make an awful lot of sense unless there's some storied reason for it. I'm thinking of things like Dark Souls, where you die, you're expected to die, and you do magically come back to, shall we say, life at a certain point. You're aware of the fact that you died, you're aware of the fact that you've lost something, and you carry on with that knowledge. It makes sense in Dark Souls. It does not make sense in more or less every other narrative-driven game. And what can make this even sillier is in Red Dead Redemption 2, the respawn point can be somewhere you've never been before. One of the first times I died was to a cougar, and I appeared on a place on the map where I'd never ever been. Now, people have tried to explain this as, well, you didn't actually die, you just came close to dying. The cougar didn't actually finish killing you and you crawled away and you got away, but you lost some money, some pelts, and you lost a little time, and that's where you finally regained consciousness on your horse, looking perfectly fine. Except I remember taking a bullet through the head and my head exploding, or a bear eating my head. You know, I mean, it's pretty hard to crawl away from those things, so it doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. And I'm afraid I'm not a fan of respawn systems in this sort of game. I find it completely obliterates the sense of narrative. It's not the end of the world, you don't die that often in this game anyway, and you can sort of mentally smudge it to create a coherent narrative, a coherent timeline for yourself by just ignoring some of these little details. But as a player, I'd rather not have to do it, and as a content creator, it's actually very irritating. I had to go out of my way sometimes to sort of hide some of these very obvious game mechanics and just try to make the story continuous. Now, those flaws were pretty minor. Slightly annoying, but pretty minor, and you get over them very quickly. You sort of, you load your game, minor irritation, figuring out where you are, and then you just move on and you play the game. I'm going to move on to a flaw that is slightly more important. It's still not critical, it still didn't ruin the game for me, but it definitely had more of an effect, and that flaw is the user interface. Now, I have two problems with the user interface. The first one is the fact that they try to move everything on the heads-up display off to the side, out of the way of the center of the screen. And that might sound a little strange, because you might be thinking, well, surely that's good. And it is. I do understand the urge to do that, to get the heads-up display elements out of the way. Trust me, if there's anyone on the planet who really appreciates a game company trying to get the heads-up display out of the way so I can see what's going on, it's me. The problem you have is heads-up displays exist for a reason. They're trying to get across information to the player that he or she should know, and I'm also a big believer that the heads-up display should do this as smoothly as possible, and I'm afraid Red Dead Redemption 2 does not do that, precisely because what it does is it drags everything to the edge where you're generally not looking most of the time. This means if you're in the middle of a dialogue or an action scene and something pops up at the top left, you have to take your eyes off the action and read the pop-up, or ignore the pop-up and miss it. Or if you're in the middle of a dialogue and the dialogue options pop up at the bottom right, you've got to take your eyes off the dialogues, the conversation that's going on, and just check what your options actually are. There is a reason why most games nowadays will actually have the activation hints for what you can do with whatever it is you're looking at very close to the center of the screen. It's so that you can know what your options are without looking away from the center of the screen, what it is you are looking at and thinking of interacting with. And as much as I sympathize with the desire to get those things out of the way of your epically crafted cinematic moment, the problem is you're forcing the player to actually just look away from the very thing you're trying not to ruin. Either that or not pay attention to the menu items and thus lose the information that might be useful. Now, it does get easier the more you play because you get used to the controls and you sort of know what many of your options are without having to look off to the side. Although you still can miss some important messages, and occasionally you will focus on someone and instead of the usual 2 options coming up, you might get a third, and you've got to check out what it is. And in fact, sometimes you might want to check anyway, even if you only get 2 options, because sometimes they do mix things up a little bit. Sometimes they will change what your options are. And that leads me to the second flaw I have with the user interface, and that is the fact that they've overloaded a lot of the buttons to do, well, multiple things, and occasionally things that just really felt very, very wrong. A classic example of this is a moment that I remember very well where I came across a guy being mauled by a bear. So I pull out my rifle and I try to aim at the bear. Unfortunately, the key for aiming is the right mouse button, which is also the same key for focusing on people. And in this particular case, when I try to aim my weapon at this grizzly bear, instead of actually aiming the weapon, I get this context menu that appears when you do that, which was very confusing. It's not instinctive. So I glance down very quickly and I see aim weapon is press the mouse button. So I'm pressing the bloody mouse button. What I hadn't noticed is it was the left mouse button, which, for those of you who don't use mouse and keyboard, is the button you normally press when you want to shoot. So the game is telling me to aim my weapon, what I need to do is press the button that I normally aim with and then press the button I normally shoot with. And I didn't even notice this, but even if I had, and I did notice it later, but even later when I had that option, it was so hard to force myself to do that. And to try and explain it, for those of you who've ever shot a gun, I want you to imagine you're on a range, you've got a target ahead of you, and you've got a handgun at your side in a holster. And you put your hand on the weapon and you try to draw it. Only it's a special weapon that won't be released from the holster unless you put your finger on the trigger and squeeze it. And just think about that. You've got your hand on a loaded weapon and you pull the trigger. But it doesn't fire. Now it releases from the holster and you can point the weapon, and then to fire it, you pull the trigger again. You see what I'm saying? Those of you who are like gun enthusiasts are probably having a case of the screaming heebie-jeebies at the moment at the thought of that. That's kind of how it feels, obviously in a slightly less deadly way, in this particular scenario. Everything about it felt wrong. So even once I knew about it, I hated it. It was really, really, well, it wasn't just counterintuitive, it was horrible. And I do get it. You've got a lot of options in Red Dead Redemption 2, a lot of different game mechanics, and you're trying to give as many options as possible with as few keys as possible so that the player doesn't have to keep moving his hands all around the keyboard. But in this particular case, I don't feel that they got it right at all. User interfaces should be as inobtrusive as possible whilst giving the player the information they need as smoothly as possible, and the way the player interacts with the game world should become fluid and instinctive the more they play. Unfortunately, I just never felt that way with Red Dead Redemption 2. Even after several hundred hours in game, there were still a lot of moments where everything felt just a little bit clumsy. Okay, so far the things I've been discussing are pretty minor in the context of such a great game, but there is another flaw that I want to talk about that had way more impact. However, I think this video has gone on long enough, and the next thing I want to talk about will probably get way more comments, so it might be better if it's actually two separate videos. That way we can discuss all these minor issues I had that I mentioned in this video, and then save the real meat and potatoes of this discussion for the next video, where I'm sure we will have a somewhat heated discussion as to whether or not I'm right regarding what I feel about certain things. So, thank you for listening to me ramble and complain away about admittedly minor things in, and I'm going to repeat this, a superb game. And if you want to hear me ramble and complain about things that are slightly more important, you can join me in the next video. I would love to have you there. I look forward to seeing you then, and until then, remember as always, have fun.